All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Bourbon and Bible Stories, episode 2. My name is Donte.
I am Amy.
And if you're new here, this is Bourbon and Bible Stories. This is our podcast where we break down the Bible. We have fun with it. We just have a drink as friends having a drink and just talk. Very relaxing, very non-judgmental environment. So thank you for tuning in. If it's your first time, and if you're a returner, thank you for coming back.
Yeah, we've appreciated all the great feedback that we got from everyone for our first episode.
Yes.
And we've been really loving the comments and any sort of, positive reinforcement. Please do continue to let us know what you think, anything you want us to talk about. We want you to be involved as much as we are involved in talking about what we want to as well.
Yeah, you guys can catch us on Instagram at bourbon_Bible_stories, and then Bourbon and Bible Stories on Facebook as well. So please, follow, comment, get engaged. We love talking to people, and let us know, like Amy said, let us know what you want us to talk about too, because when we're done with this series, the world is your oyster. We can talk about anything. So it should be good.
Well, Donte, how have you been since we last talked? It's been about a month since,
Yeah.
I guess about since we recorded,
Since we
too.
recorded, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, I guess it was about a month. Yeah, it's been good. Work started, I should say. Work started. And so that's been good. It's been a smooth start to the year for me, in that regard. School, I'm doing my second master's degree, so school at the seminary, and so that's been interesting, doing a lot of deep diving into how to research, because I'm sort of preparing to get to that PhD level. So
fancy.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. I had a fun conversation with a professor who's worked with me on my last thesis, and he said two things. One, he was being facetious but serious, because he wrote his thesis on demonic possession. And
Okay.
He goes, I'm being funny, but I'm dead serious. Let your thesis question possess you. And
Ooh,
he's
I like that.
he's like,
I
let
like
it
that.
take over you. He's like, you should be thinking about it all the time, like washing dishes,
Also on
driving
theme
the
for
car.
our reading today.
Yeah, exactly. And then he said, write every day, which was something I hadn't been
Nice.
doing. I've been taking a day, I'd go to Barnes and Noble at 8 in the morning, and I'd just sit there till 4 in the afternoon. But I'm not writing for 8 hours. It's I'm writing for an hour. I'm going and looking at a book in this section. I'm well, I'm going up to Starbucks to get more coffee. You know what I mean? And he's like, no, write 10 minutes a day if you have to, but just write every day. And I'm not even at the part where you get to the last year and it's just writing your dissertation or whatever. I'm not even there yet. I'm still taking coursework. But he's like, what you're thinking, start it. And
why not?
Even
Yeah.
if you don't use everything. So there was some good stuff. So yeah, a lot of good stuff, a lot of fun stuff. Busy, but it's cool. How you been?
Well, we do work together, so
Yeah,
I've also started working. But it's been a good start so far, and I had a birthday since we last spoke, since we were last on
I'm sorry
here.
I couldn't make it out for drinks that night, by the way.
I was out with the Reverend.
I know, yeah. Shout out to Reverend Mike.
Reverend Mike.
We know you're watching.
Past the point where birthdays are
Yeah.
where it's just going out with one or two people is totally fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, I started school. We start school with field trips, so
Yes,
took a bunch of
we
kids
do.
to New York City and had a lot of fun with that. Very exhausted, but
Yes, so
it's bittersweet going back to work, because obviously I would rather be not working. But the kids are really great, and I'm having a good time getting back going and having something to do every day.
Yeah.
Getting back on the grind.
Yeah. It's good. It's fun. Well, listen, guys, we're gonna jump into that. We've been thinking about our first episode and kind of little things we can add, and so something that I think we agreed that we wanted to try to do is start our episodes with a little maybe quote or poem or just something that's it doesn't necessarily have to do with the episode, but something that one of us finds to be useful and important. So,
and I know Dante's been excited to share this,
yes.
And I'm excited to hear what it is. I've been in anticipation.
Yes. So I'm going to share a poem today, and so I'm going to put this up in the camera. Hopefully you can see it. This book is called Revolutionary Patience. It's by a German theologian. Her name is Dorothy Zola. If you get the opportunity, I would suggest reading a lot of her books. She's a Christian theologian. She's a feminist. She's what people would describe as a mystic. And so she has a lot, and she was writing during the World War II period. So she has a lot of reflections on just being a German citizen and seeing what happened in the Holocaust, and like a lot of commentary on where is God in suffering, because she's, watching this atrocity happen. So really, really, really like powerful stuff. But she also was a poet. So this book, Revolutionary Patience, is just a book of poetry. And so I was reading this for a class, and I had to pick one of her poems. And this one really, really stuck out to me. And I'll explain why, but I'll read it first. And so the title is, I don't, as they put it, believe in God. So she says, I don't, as they put it, believe in God. But to him, I cannot say no, hard as I try. Take a look at him in the garden, when his friends ran out on him, his face wet with fear, and with the spit of his enemies. Him I have to believe. Him I can't bear to abandon. To the great disregard for life, to the monotonous passing of millions of years, to the moronic rhythm of work, leisure, and work, to the boredom we fail to dispel in cars, in beds, in stores. That's how it is, they say. What do you want? Uncertain and not uncritically. I subscribe to the other hypothesis, which is his story. That's not how it is. That's not how it is, he said, for God is. And he staked his life on this claim. Thinking about it, I find one can't let him pay alone for his hypothesis, so I believe him about God. The way one believes another's laughter, his tears, or marriage, or no for an answer. That's how you'll learn to believe him about life promised to all. And so that poem, when she's saying, I don't, as they put it, believe in God, and then she starts to talk about Jesus, right? And so my interpretation of the poem is that she's looking at sort of just that kind of general, like, oh, well, do you believe in God? Do you believe in this like disembodied, Father in heaven, like what we would say is the Father part of the Trinity? Mm-hmm. And she's like, that part is actually the part that I struggle with. But then she starts to talk about Jesus and like a lot of his humanness. Like when she says, I can't bear to abandon, it's him I have to believe. She says when his friends ran out on him in the garden, that's that Garden of Gethsemane, he's praying before his crucifixion, his face wet with fear, the spit of his enemies, him I have to believe. So she's describing like the life, the trial of Jesus. And what it really spoke to me about is like, you can sort of have doubts about God in that really like existential space where you're just like, I don't know if God's really up there and what's going on. But the story of Jesus and everything Jesus stood for, the crucifixion of Jesus, right, dying on behalf of the oppressed and the struggle and people that are struggling, that story is so compelling that it's worth believing in. I heard someone say it like this, it's worth being wrong about. Like, I'm willing to be wrong about Jesus because the Jesus story is so compelling. And so maybe I struggle at times with like having the perfect put together faith, but I never struggle with Jesus. I'm so compelled. Anytime I have like a mini crisis of faith, I just go back to Jesus, because the idea that God is incarnate in this like hippie, preacher that hung around with like prostitutes and the poor is so compelling to me that I'm like, if I get to the end and I'm wrong about it, fine. But it's so worth believing it. It's so compelling. It's something that that I really am stuck with. And I even like the way she says, the way I believe in him, the way one believes in another's laughter or tears or marriage. It's like, it's so raw. Like, and that's always how I think about Jesus. Like, it's not something that I have to be academic about. Like, I don't have to be like, well, the reason I believe in Jesus is that, and like give you some sort of philosophy. It's like, nah, it kind of just tugs at my heart, and I can't really separate from it.
there's a lot there, a lot to kind of process, and I like the way you explained it with, she's questioning like this one part of the Trinity,
right.
and like and for those of you, I mean, obviously I haven't gotten into everything in my background yet, but it's I'm not as big of a believer as you are, Donte.
Yeah.
And I definitely question God. I definitely that's probably the part I have the hardest part with as well.
Right.
And I'm also not familiar with this story of Jesus. Like I know the basics of the story, and I do consider him to be a revolutionary.
Right.
And I do think that he is an incredible figure of peace, but sometimes it's hard for me to even contextualize Jesus as this peaceful revolutionary within like this Old Testament God that we've been reading about now.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot. Thank you for sharing that. I did really enjoy that poem. I need to read it more on my own. I feel like that's when I need to like read on my own and dig into a little bit more too.
Yeah. No, I would encourage reading any of her work, but if like her work is a little too like, if you're not ready to get into your like seminarian bag, like read her poetry, because then the poetry is a little bit easier, and just it's abstract and creative, so it's dope. But yeah, so today you want to lead us in, because I feel like you have a lot to say. We're doing for the folks at home. We're doing Genesis 3 and 4. So if you were with us last week, we started with the creation story, but we got so into it that we really never got to Genesis 3. The plan for today was to talk about Cain and Abel. That's a shorter story, so we should have time to get that in, but we got to spend a little bit of time getting into Genesis 3, because that's where we have a lot of talk about the
gender.
serpent and about Eve, and we're going to talk about gender, and I think this is some really salient stuff to talk about. So I assume you have a lot to say about Genesis 3.
Yeah, so I mean, even with the first two chapters, they weren't, I wouldn't say like problematic, or like, chapter 1 pretty straightforward, chapter 2 like okay. This is where I'm starting to be like, okay.
Yeah.
Let's take a step back here. Where to even start? I have my notes, I have my reading. I guess we can start with the serpent.
Yes.
Though. Okay, so, the story kind of opens with this serpent who is tempting Eve. They are in the garden. They have the trees. The rules have been laid down. And, and as I said last time, one of my problems with kind of this whole premise that we're starting off with is like, these are the rules, you have to follow them. And it's just kind of a recipe for failure. Right. And so this is the failure. So, we start off with this serpent, and as I said last time, I have lots of wonderful footnotes, and this week reading, I did try actually to step away from those a little bit more, and especially the headings, and it is helpful for me actually to kind of like read it without that context. But one thing that was kind of funny in these footnotes is when they were talking about the serpent at the beginning, is how it's not, I mean, obviously we think of a serpent as a snake in its current form.
Right.
And they start describing it as like this beautiful mystic creature that's like, like not how we consider a snake today.
Right.
And, he's coming up talking to Eve, says like, hey, you should try some of this fruit.
Yeah.
It's going to give you some knowledge, which, as I said before, as a teacher, I think that's a good thing. Shouldn't we crave knowledge? Shouldn't she want to have this knowledge?
Right.
It is forbidden. God did lay this rule. But I guess one of the first kind of like contradictions I'm having upon reading this is, isn't the serpent also a creation of God? And kind of like, how do we, like, we have this serpent who is tempting Eve, who's saying, you should try this, and it doesn't even specifically say apple, but it's like, you should try this fruit. This is going to be good. Like, it's going to help you eat. You need to eat. And she takes it. She takes it. I will say as well, when I was reading this, I actually had kind of like a flashback to like the Barbie movie.
I haven't seen it yet, but that's
oh my god, you need to see it.
My wife saw it. I got it. I know I got to go see it.
It's so good. It is so good.
I've heard great things.
I mean, I could talk about that forever, but there's one, or like in this story though, so like first Eve eats the fruit, she realizes, that she has knowledge after eating this fruit, and then she gives it to Adam.
Yeah.
And Adam's just like, okay. Like, and that's the part that kind of reminded me of Barbie, of just like, Adam's not thinking.
Right.
He's not like thinking like, oh, this is a rule that was set. It's just like, okay, Barbie, I'll take this.
Yeah.
Like, I'll do what you say. And Eve's really the main one who gets punished. Adam did it too. They do both get punished, and the serpent does get punished. But I guess Eve really gets it the worst. And
Maybe.
Oh, okay. Tell me, what do you mean by maybe?
So I'm going to start by saying, and this is something that I'm going to use this as an analogy. How familiar are you with baseball?
Relative. That was like the one sport my father watched.
Okay.
So
right.
like I know it enough. Like we followed the Braves.
So yeah, it figures. So go Phils. So
although he did like the Phillies next.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Good. So when someone's coming up to the plate in baseball, right?
Okay.
They'll, depending on the pitcher that they're facing, people will always talk about your approach at the plate. Right. And so if you've ever played baseball or softball or even just watching it, you'll notice like if you're facing a different type of pitcher, you have to adjust your approach. It's the same plate. It's the same ball that's coming across. But because of how that ball is coming, if you want to be successful in hitting it, you may have to stand differently. You may have to tilt an elbow up, whatever. And I think that we always need to think about our approach at the plate when we look at scripture. So a lot of times when people are like, well, everything is Eve's fault, and they blamed everything on the women, and Adam didn't get as much fault, and Satan came in and tempted them, but why did God let them do that? We're starting with all of these presuppositions, but those things are not necessarily what's inferred originally in the text. And a lot of that comes from, honestly, some of the things we've been taught in church. So, for example, one thing that's, I think, sometimes people don't realize, nowhere in the scripture does it call the serpent Satan. And you didn't call the serpent Satan either, which is good, but like that, it's important.
Well, the footnotes did imply it.
Yeah, because that's what we've come to believe. But what we have to remember is like the figure El Satan comes out, or I don't know if I said that right, but whatever. It's like I think it's Ha-Satan, something like that. But he comes about first in Job. And then there's like other figures that are demonish or devilish, whatever. Like there's different figures that aren't all connected. Later on, as the church is organizing, they start to connect all these different figures, and you come up with this one central figure, the devil, Satan, whatever, right? But at the end of the day, when this was written, it's just a snake. And the word for snake is like arum, something like that. It's A-R-U-M. And it implies one that is like wise, not necessarily one that's there to like, fuck up your day. It's just one that is wise. And I think, again, going back to, and I think I talked about this a little bit last episode, like this story being not a literal story, not someone saying this is how the world came to be, but a story that's meant to like give us make some commentary on the nature of life and being. So if this is more of like a coming of age tale, right, and it's talking about humanity and how as we grow, we acquire knowledge, and when we acquire knowledge, we acquire different consequences of having knowledge and things like that. That's sort of the same thing that's happening here. So I think we've attached a lot to the gender piece, and we've attached a lot to Eve. I'm not convinced that was the original author's intent. I think the original author's intent was to tell a story of, okay, God creates humans, and humans sort of have this free reign. They have this opportunity to gain knowledge. And again, I don't remember if I said this last week, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil is not just the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil, but the way it's implied in Hebrew is that it's a spectrum. So it's the knowledge of good, evil, and everything in between. So it's just all knowledge. And the idea of like not taking the fruit from the tree is less about, or I would say less about God being like, oh, you can't obtain this knowledge, and more about, kind of like, hey, if you get this knowledge, there are things that come with that, right? And I think the story is really trying to comment on how we grow, we gain knowledge, and then we we have revelations or just understandings that come from that. And I think, like, to some extent, like, whether the snake talks to Eve or the snake talks to Adam is almost like incidental. Like, it almost doesn't matter. Like, that's just like, it's a fable in some sense. Like, and they chose to have the serpent talk to Eve and be the one to get her to eat the fruit. But I don't think we were actually supposed to zoom in on that specific detail. I think the idea, the overarching idea is, hey, humans acquire knowledge, and when we acquire knowledge, sometimes we try to acquire too much knowledge. We try to be like God. We try to become all-knowing, and we can't handle what comes with being all-knowing. And this story is sort of commenting on that. But people who want to read the story super literally will go in and they'll start to sort of create things that I don't think are really there, like saying, well, like, basically, and it's less prevalent now, but this was prevalent in the church for a long time. Like, this casting women as crafty and, crafting women as crafty and manipulative and things like that. A lot of times people will go back to Eve. I was just writing a paper talking about, violence in the Black community. And I was talking about how, like, certain pastors talk about it. And I was watching a sermon for research. And, like, the sermon's like, the reason that there's violence in the community is because there's no fathers and the women are not equipped to, because it's not their role. And he's going back to Adam and Eve saying, like, it wasn't Eve's role to do X, Y, and Z. And it's not women's role. And he's essentially, like, saying, like, women aren't strong enough to raise kids that won't shoot each other, which is, like, a wild thing to say, but you're reading that into it. Like, I don't think that was ever the intention of this text.
Well, and this is so, like, and I always love hearing your interpretation, and like, and that's, and it's kind of a new interpretation for me, but part of, like, where I get so caught up with this is kind of like what you're talking about, and not even so much like current day, but like, like right now I'm I started teaching my AP US history class. Yeah. And we're in the colonial period. Yeah. And it astounds me the extent to which even what we talked about in the first 2 chapters, I'm seeing present in some of the primary source materials that I'm, like, presenting to these kids. And so much of, like, the subjugation of women goes back to this story. Yeah. And the way that, in history, we have been able to justify that women are less, that women are witches, hence my Stevie Nicks candle. But it all comes back to this story. Yeah. And while I love this interpretation that you have, it's just really hard for me to kind of get over how this story has been used throughout history to, portray women in certain lights.
And I think that's fair. Where I would push back is, like, if it wasn't the Bible, it'd be something else.
That's fair.
Like, they like fair. And like, I could send you a list this big of things that people have used the Bible to justify: slavery, the mistreatment of women, rape in some cases. Right? There's been all kinds of ways that people have used homophobia. They've used the Bible to justify things, and that's because some people only view the Bible as a tool for their own political agenda and their own rhetorical goals. And even to your point about the subjugation of women, the word that's used, and I don't know the word off the top of my head, but the word that's used to describe Eve, it gets translated as helpmate, I think, in a couple of versions. That word very specifically, and I have a ton of, like, Jewish scholars that comment on this, does not imply a subordinate position. It implies equality. So the original text implies that Eve is equal to Adam. We made Eve subjugated. And that's my thing. It's like, we are putting, like I don't know if we always realize how much we add to the text without adding words to the text.
Well, I would say this text is pretty explicit about it. So, like, the exact words. Okay, well, and this also, this was the quote in my notes. I literally wrote, "Fuck this." Yeah. So it's 3:16, but it's the last part that I'm kind of referring to. But I'll read the whole thing just for fun. Unto the woman he said, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Mm-hmm. So, like, it's explicit in here.
But so now here's the back end of that. First of all, that's not how it was created. That's how it becomes, right? So that off the bat implies that that's not what was intended. But the other thing that's important to note is that the word curse in Hebrew is never used, right? Okay. So this isn't really supposed to be describing a curse as much as it's supposed to be describing the way things have become. So again, Adam is cursed or ends up toiling the fields, right? Eve ends up having pain in childbirth. Eve ends up being subordinate to her husband, all of those things. What most scholars would say is that the authors of this text are intending to they're talking about society as it is. So you have, they're writing in a patriarchal society where most of the men go out and toil the fields and try to get what they need, and where women are, sometimes having babies, sometimes dying in labor, things like that. And the idea is, once we've gained knowledge, we come to understand how all of these things come about, right? So again, when we're young, when we're immature, maybe we know that we get food, we know that we get fruit, we know that we get things. As we grow, we realize that there's suffering that goes into that. I have to go out, I have to toil in the hot sun, I have to hope it rains enough, right? All of that is a part of that, right? That's a part of me gaining knowledge, is understanding that there's a back end to this. For women, as they grow, right? Oh my gosh, babies, we have babies. Oh, this is what it is. This is what it means to put my body out, to be on the line. And then even the idea that as we grow, women become subordinate to men, those were just the gender roles that were created by society. If anything, all the text is commenting on is, this is how society is. This is how it's become. And again, there was we've used this text to try to say that women need to be subordinate to men, when all it's describing is a time and place when that had utility, right? If you live in some agricultural society where God knows what can come into your tent or hut or whatever and kill you at night, and where there are tribes that are constantly at war, nomadic tribes that will come and, take what you have, rape your women, things like that. The utility of men becomes the hunters, the protectors, just based off of genetic brute strength. That becomes a role. And women are constantly having babies because you have large families, because infant mortality is high, right? So women are always having babies. They're constantly in vulnerable positions. So it started off with some utility. Where it gets wonky is if in 2023 you're trying to tell my wife she can't go to work anymore, and that I got to tell her how things need to be. Hey, guess what? I don't have to hunt anymore, buddy. Like, we got a 2-income household. When we make financial decisions, me and my wife talk about them together. But I don't think that the intention of this text was, hey, in 2000 or in 5,000 years, you better still be living this way. Right. And I often compare the Bible to the Constitution in that way. Like, think about the Second Amendment, right?
Okay.
An amendment was written for the, now I'm going to botch it. Right. In a very specific context. I was about to say it and I was like, I'm about to botch it. But what is it? In knowing that to preserve a union, a militia, in understanding a well-regulated militia is necessary to protect a perfect union, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Yeah. Something like that. I know I messed it up, but something like that.
You got the most important parts. Yeah.
So you go, okay, what's the context of that? Okay, they raised militias. There's no standing army. There's no machine guns. There's no bombs. There's no things. So now in 2023, we're going, well, how do we interpret this? And we have to take all of that into account when we try to interpret it. And some people will still interpret that we still have a right to bear arms in some way, shape, or form. Some people would say it's completely irrelevant, but there's a lot of push and pull there. And it's the same thing in this text. And really throughout the entire Bible, there are going to be places in the Bible that support an agenda that is very patriarchal, because it was written by people that lived in a society that are very patriarchal. But I would urge anyone not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's okay to, I think, criticize, I think it's okay to say fuck that. I think it's okay to say that's messed up or whatever. And it's also okay to be like, maybe that was how it worked for that time. But I think this story loses a lot of the beauty in it, right? Like a lot of what we talked about last week with like the dealing with suffering and stuff like that, because everyone wants to try to use it to subjugate women. And I don't think the authors cared that much about subjugating women when they wrote this. I don't think that's their intention.
So
really.
yeah, I lot to think about there, and I really do. I think thinking about things with the times is always important, and like personally, whenever I do think about the Constitution and all of these different things, that is how I think about it. Is it should always be interpreted with the times.
Yeah,
personal opinion. Many people don't believe that, and I think that's part of where I also get caught up with this is like, we last time we were also talking about how you said not as many people have this view that this Bible is presenting, which I do think especially like up here around Philadelphia, which is it's much more progressive here. One reason I do like living up here. But like back in North Carolina, like a lot of people do still hold those interpretations, and I guess that is just where I get caught with it. So I guess my question for you is like, what for you is the beauty in this story? Because it is hard for me to like identify the beauty in this story.
Yeah, so for me, the beauty in this story, if we're going like Genesis 1-3, first of all, I think we're having a conversation about who God is, and we're having two conversations, right? The first 1 to like 2:24 or whatever it is presents God in this very regal manner, and then the other one presents God as sort of right here with us. And I like, I think and then I'll backtrack and say, approach at the plate, right? If we don't necessarily read the Bible as, okay, what is this saying directly to me right now in this time period, and look at it as an invitation into a conversation about God, I think you get more utility out of it. So I feel when I read this scripture, I'm being invited into a conversation that's happening. One side of the conversation is talking about God in this very regal way. He creates in 7 days. It's very symmetrical, all of these things. The other is talking about God in this very anthropomorphic, he's right there with us and not necessarily all knowing. There are these themes of gaining knowledge and coming into suffering and kind of looking at the world as the way it is. And I think it's really fruitful to have conversations about what this means. If we agree that there is a creator, what does that creator do? What does that creator look like? Also, probably the most beautiful part of this text, and we didn't really dig into this, but something that really like digs deep into my heart is where it says, we call it the Imago Dei, or that we're all created in the image of God.
Okay.
And if we're all created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, I think it literally translates to image bearers. So we all bear the image of God. That means the homeless person on the street bears the image of God. That means a Republican bears the image of God, a Democrat, a gay person, a transgender person, a child, an old person, anyone that you think you are upset with, that boss you don't like, that neighbor that gets on your nerves, they all bear God's image. We all are pieces of God. We all are fearfully and wonderfully made. And that's very powerful to me, because that changes how I have to act in the world. If I have a disdain for the homeless, I have a disdain for God. If I have a disdain for the oppressed, I have a disdain for God. They bear God's image. That changes how I vote. That changes what I do with my money, because I'm not just trying to be woke. I'm not just trying to do like the right thing. I am trying to take care of people who bear God's image. And that's beautiful to me.
That is beautiful.
There's so much here, and it's a shame. And I want to be clear too. I'm not saying that the scripture doesn't have patriarchal bullshit tied into it.
Right.
It does, because the authors come from that time. I just think that we need to get more comfortable with being able to separate that, and not having to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and also not having to keep everything. And this is something that, to your point about, so many people still holding on to this. The reason that so many people still hold on to this is because if you're told this is the word of God and it's all literal, then you can't have one thing be wrong. Because then
Right.
a lot of people will go, oh, well, if one thing's wrong, it's all wrong. It's all, I can't do anything, but I can't, like, so they're like, I gotta justify everything that's in here. That's one reason. The other reason is that, quite frankly, patriarchy is still useful for men. And so many men will read those scriptures and they'll go, yup, see, you got to obey me.
Here's why.
Right.
Yep.
But again, if you're someone who likes guns, you can interpret the Second Amendment to be useful for you. Right. And so I think sometimes we're a little bit, and this may be my own personal bias as a Christian, but sometimes I think we're almost unfair to the Bible, where we almost hold it to a standard that we don't hold any other text to, where we're like, if this has something I disagree with, that means it's trash, throw the whole thing out. You would not say that about the Constitution, and you would not read the Constitution and say, if there is one thing in this document that I disagree with, I'm throwing the whole thing out. Our government doesn't need it. It's trash. Like, no, we all like all men are created equal. Like, we all like, I guess that's the declaration,
and we have
but
made
still,
amendments to it since then.
right. And
Yeah.
we've made amendments, and we've had constant debates and questioned what does it stand for? What does it mean? And how can we make all of these things relevant? And if all men are not being treated as they are created equal, how do we uphold America's original promise? And I think we can do the same thing with the Bible. I'm a big fan of being okay with saying, I don't like this verse.
Well,
I don't think you're going to get struck down if you say that.
I'm actually really liking this comparison with the Constitution. It's actually really helpful for me to make that comparison. And I think, one thing for me as, we continue to read this and as we continue to explore this is that, like for me, I know the values that are in place in the Constitution. You know, I've read, these philosophical thinkers. I know blah, 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 blah. And from where we are in the Bible so far, I don't feel like I have a sense of values yet.
Yeah.
So like, I think that's one of my struggles with where we're at. And like, while I believe you, and while, I have heard interpretate, like just from where we're at so far, I have not seen values that necessarily align with that.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to get there. I know we will get there. I think much more in the New Testament than in the Old Testament. But like, I see these values, or I hear these values, but I have not seen those values yet.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's important, I think a lot of people are waiting for the Bible to tell them everything. But like, if someone were to ask me, I'll put it this way. If someone were to ask me like, okay, I'm trying to get more connected with God and, all of these things. What should I do? I can only do one thing. Should I pray? Should I read the Bible? Should I, and they list a bunch of different, pious things that they can do. And I would say, well, you should like pray and meditate first before you ever pick up this book, because you can make these things mean whatever you want them to mean. So if we're waiting for the Bible to impart values on us, but we haven't taken time to try to commune with the creator that this is supposed to be representing.
Fair point, Donte.
We're not going to, what I mean? Like, we're not going to see any values. Like, I find the values in the Bible, but I believe God to be loving without the Bible. You know what I mean? Like, that comes from a personal relationship with God. Then I go into the Bible and I find the loving and the life-giving text. And when I find things that are not loving and life-giving, I go, well, these things are probably not of God. Right. And again, I'm comfortable. Not everyone's comfortable saying that. I'm comfortable with that because I view the Bible as a human creation, human and God. I don't think that it fell out of the sky or anything like that. Like, humans are compiling this and they're having conversations and they're trying to. And there can be moments where you see a little bit more. That's a little bit more Paul than that is God. That's a little bit more Moses than it is God. Like, you can see that in the text, and I think it's completely okay to say, right, there's a lot of, if we wanted, we'd have to do another episode on it, but if we wanted to get into slavery, right, like, there's a lot of things that you could look at that and go, this is justifying slavery. But for me, it's I don't need to like try to make those verses make sense and somehow be justifiable, or just say like, they lived in a society where slavery had utility for them. They interpreted it as an okay thing to do, and they felt that it must be something that God commanded, and that's how they wrote it. But I don't think that that's useful for us anymore, and I don't agree with it.
I like that approach,
and I'm okay with that. Like,
I like that approach. That's how it was then, and I think, and like I said before, that's kind of where I get caught. It's just like how it has been used and justified in the past, which is also different from its interpretation, which is different from how it's used and justified and interpreted today.
Yeah. And the thing that people should know about the history of the Bible is so many verses fall in and out of favor based on the time period and how useful they are, right? So, there are verses in the so the slavery verses, right? They were very useful in the 1800s.
Yeah.
No one talks about them anymore. No one preaches on them anymore because no one owns slaves in America, at least. No one owns slaves anymore. It's not a useful thing. And all of a sudden, it's just something you could find a tract about the Bible and slavery in every Southern home, in 1840, but now no one talks about it, right? Abortion. Prior to the mid-1900s, most Christians were fine with it being, they said safe, legal, and rare. Basically, like, if it has to happen, like, under a doctor's eye, and, there's sometimes that's necessary. It became, Jerry Falwell and some other conservative evangelicals made it a big political talking point. They tried to get judges and people in the White House that would support it, and there's a whole history behind it that we don't need to go into, but once it became a thing in the mid-19th century or the mid-20th century, the 1950s, 1960s, all of a sudden there's this shift and people are pulling different verses and, I knew you before you were formed. See, that means you can't have an abortion, right? And all these things. And now those verses become something that people, sort of coalesce around. But once that doesn't become an issue anymore, those verses get marginalized. Like the Bible there's thousands of verses in the Bible, and there's ebbs and flows, and so I think too, like, sometimes we get caught in our own time period where we're like, but no, this verse, this interpretation, it's so everyone believes this, and if it wasn't here, it wouldn't happen. If the Bible never said this, people wouldn't hate women. If the Bible never said this, people wouldn't go to war. Yes, they would. They would just find different excuses.
Right.
Like. Yeah.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, should we move on?
Yeah,
to
you
our
want to
next
jump
story?
into Cain and Abel?
Cain and Abel.
Yeah,
okay, let me. I just closed this and now I'm gonna open it again. Okay, let's see. Cain and Abel. So I mean the basis of this story, my understanding, and like you said, this is a shorter story.
Yeah.
We have our first murder.
Yes.
So,
first time the word sin is used, by the way.
Oh, I did not notice.
So that whole Adam and Eve thing, the word sin's never used, which is again why, not to take us all the way back there, but why I say, like, we have to adjust our approach. Like, this isn't about Eve committing some sin. Sin's never used.
Well, so this story was, and this is when I did have a couple more questions on, and I also, don't want to take us on for too long, but it's, so it says Abel is essentially a shepherd. He tends with the sheep. Cain is essentially a farmer working with the ground.
Right.
And it says both Cain and Abel have some kind of offering to God. So it's kind of establishing that this relationship is, like they are giving something, some sort of sacrifice, which is fine, whatever. But what I didn't get is, it seems like it says God, I mean, these are my notes, not what it said. God liked what Abel brought, but not what Cain brought.
Yeah. So
why?
So I'm gonna read a quote real quick, to that I think can help get into that a little bit. And this is from Walter Brueggemann. He's a theologian. He writes commentary, Old Testament theologian, or a biblical scholar. So he says, the narrative is talking about Cain and Abel. The narrative is not for moral instruction. It enables us to reflect on the enigmatic situation in which we are set. Every person is willy-nilly set between a sister-brother with whom we compete and a God who acts towards us seemingly in seemingly capricious ways. It is not only the problem of the brother, for Cain had quickly resolved that, nor is it the problem of God. It is the problem of the brother and God together that create conflict for Cain and finally lead to his unbearable destiny. We try as best we can to separate the human predicament from the God question. Things are then bearable, but this narrative insists that they converge and cannot be separated. And what he's kind of getting at there is that, and this was even interesting for me as I was doing a little bit of research, is that the story, one, isn't even really about Abel, right? Abel doesn't have much, into it, but it's about this idea of God having a preference and then what we do with that. and how we deal with that, right? And you actually see this theme repeated. Think the prodigal son, right? The father loves the son that came back and was being a fuck up and was out there partying, and the other son is like, wait, but what about me, right? Jacob and Esau, that's another brother jealousy thing. So this is probably a common theme. You see it in other literature, right? So they're kind of attacking this theme, and what's being talked about here, it never says, interestingly enough, that Cain did anything wrong.
Yeah, well, that's part of what my problem was when I was reading this. Is like, what did Cain do?
But that's the thing.
Like,
so this
like, why didn't God like what he brought?
But here's the thing. It doesn't say God didn't like what he brought either. So this is another thing where church has kind of tainted what is actually being said in the text. I've heard pastors say, oh, well, Cain just bought some little old vegetables and he should have bought something better. Like they put it on Cain. I've even heard pastors go as far as to like tie this to tithes and offerings and go like, yeah, if you're not giving your best, then God's not going to be happy with. That's not.
Yeah, don't like
that's
that.
That's not in this. All it says is that, Cain, he brought what he had, which was fruits, vegetables, whatever, agriculture. The shepherd brought what he had. In that moment, for whatever reason, God preferred Abel's. And then Cain has to deal with that. But how often in our lives does it seem like God prefers someone else or something else?
Yeah.
Me and you are going up for the same job. You get it, I don't. Well, why God prefer you? Maybe I just need to be patient. Maybe Cain just needed to sit back. What's interesting is at the end of the story, when God, and again, if you go through like Jewish law in Leviticus, when you kill someone, you're supposed to get killed. It's a life for a life.
Well, that was one of the other things that I really, I guess my main other question with this is how, you know, he gets his punishments. I did also think it was kind of funny, and you know, obviously I know some of where this is going, where he goes, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Like I feel like I can just see like a teenager being like, "Well, you didn't explicitly say that's a rule, so do I have to do it?"
Right.
But like, so you can see where that's going. But this part of like being punished with death sevenfold was like, for me, that just feels a little bit contradictory of like, you kill, so then you are killed. But
then
yes,
he wasn't.
context.
I was gonna say, but then he wasn't killed. He
went on to like create a civilization.
Yeah, he was. So, and another, just a comment on that. A lot of the word that Cain comes from, they believe, is the word that's at the root of the Kenites, which was a nomadic civilization that was around at the same time. So some scholars say that this is an etiology for that group of people. You know, so it's like, where did the Kenites come from? Well, and there's a lot of stories in the Bible that have that. So that's also part of it. But he, theoretically, God should have killed him for killing Abel. He says to God, someone's going to kill me. I'm so afraid. And God says, I will put my mark on you and no one will touch you. So God actually shows him mercy. So again, you go from Cain going, well, God doesn't have preference for me, to then God saying, I'm actually going to protect you for the rest of your life. And Cain goes on to, like you said, start a whole civilization, get married, the whole thing, right? And so I think it really asks us to deal with this idea of preference, even in things like, you know, death, for example. I remember my mom had cancer, and, you know, there's people like, you know, my mom actually had cancer twice in her life. And the first time it was like, she was healed, right? And it's like, she always says, it's miraculous, I was healed, blah, 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 blah. And I've heard those stories from other people. The second time, not so much. And that's a moment where we could go, well, how come God healed that person but not my mom? How come God did this for this person but not that person? And I think that's actually more what this story wants us to wrestle with. And even if you look at the sin is not the murder. The sin is, and I don't know if we have time to dig up what verse it says it in, but basically it says it was Cain not being able to control how he felt about the fact that God preferred Abel's sacrifice, right? And that gets done. Jesus does that a lot in the New Testament, where he's like, oh, the law says don't commit adultery, but I'm saying don't even lust, right? So it's like, yeah, you could not cheat on your wife, but still be lusting after women who aren't your wife. So Jesus is attacking the root, not the result. And it's the same thing here. Like, God is upset with, not necessarily, I mean, of course God's upset with the result, but the fact is, if you had just contained your sort of jealousy, you would have never gotten to the murder. And so it really, and I think some of what Walter was talking about in that quote is like, we don't know why God does what God does. We don't know why some of us end up losing our jobs or being poor or getting sick with terminal illnesses or whatever. We really don't. We wrestle with it all the time. But if we allow it to eat us away, to create envy, to create jealousy, that's going to become harmful, right? And we need to figure out how to. And I'm a big fan of questioning God, being mad at God, doing whatever you have to do, but don't let it poison you to the point that you harm your brother. And, you know, I'm saying that metaphorically.
I think one of my takeaways from the way you just described this, and for me as I'm continuing to read this, is I think it's easy for me to get fixated on God not being just, or God being contradictory, or God doing these things that I think are fucked up.
Yeah.
But what I'm liking a lot of your interpretation is more so focusing on the people.
Yeah.
And how they're reacting, and thinking about the lessons of the people, and how they're reacting to these, because it's almost like when God are doing these things that I don't like, quite frankly.
Right.
The lesson isn't so much about being angry with God, which I think is where I naturally go, and where I think a lot of people naturally go. But how can we deal with these unfair circumstances that are going to continue to happen to us every day?
Right. And I'll kind of wrap up on this, but like, again, it's okay to question God. It's okay to be mad at God. It's okay to be upset, but let yourself wrestle. And like, again, always pay attention, especially in these stories. These are called the primeval myths, or the primeval stories. They have intentional lessons in them. Pay attention to how they conclude. The story ends, despite what Cain does, the story ends with God showing him mercy and protecting him for the rest of his days, right? So it implies that you can get mad at God, you can go as far as to take life, but that will not separate God from you. That will not stop God from having mercy on you. That will not stop God from supporting you. And I would say, whether it's the Cain and Abel text or the flood or anything else, read into these texts and figure out what questions this is calling to you about God. What discussions is this bringing you into? The Bible is a discussion about God, and you're being invited in by the text. So get invited in, figure out what the questions are. You might leave with more questions than answers. That's okay, but that's part of life. It's a process, and be willing to be a part of the process. Too many people become a part of the process, realize it's a process, and then they leave and they go, I didn't get the answer I wanted, so I'm out. I would encourage you not to do that. I would say be a willing participant every single day in the process. Even if some days part of that process is being angry, even if some days part of that process is being mad at God, continue to be a part of that process. And I think you'll find peace and you'll find joy on the other side of that process. So that'd be my takeaway from everything.
I see you're out of your drink, but I would love to do just a final ching.
Final ching. Yeah, we didn't do a little cheers at the beginning, but yes. So cheers as always. Had a great time with this episode. Next time we should be due up for the flood. So that's a fun one. So definitely tune in next time. Genesis 6, the flood. Again, please comment, follow, like, subscribe, all the things.
It means a lot more than you might realize. Yeah. We read everything, and we want to hear what you all have to say and share it with anyone. Doesn't have to be people we know.
Yes.
We want to, involve as many people as possible and spread the word.
Yeah, and just get engaged, man. We just want we do this because we like having these conversations, and we want you to think about things differently. You don't have to agree with a word I said, but if you're getting engaged with it, that's the most important part. So cheers, and we'll see you next time.